I rushed home to tell my family I had just won the $80 million Florida Lotto. My heart was pounding out of my chest, ready to share the wealth and finally be accepted. But before I could even take my coat off, my mother slid a legal document across the dining table and snapped, "Pack your things, because this house is your sister's now. You are grown, so go figure it out on your own." I did not scream. I did not cry. I just touched the winning ticket in my pocket, smiled, and walked out into the night. The next morning, they saw my name on the news, and their entire world collapsed. I am Harper Davenport, 31 years old, and this is the story of how my family tried to bury me, not knowing I held the ultimate weapon. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of South Florida, my family was obsessed with image. We were part of the Black elite, a world where your worth was measured by your country club membership, the church pews you occupied, and the designer labels draped across your shoulders. My mother, Vivica, was the president of the church women's board and a proud member of a prestigious sorority. She wore her status like a crown, demanding absolute perfection from everyone around her. My father, Roland, was a local politician and real estate broker who loved to flash wealth we did not actually have. They poured all their resources and affection into my younger sister, Bianca. At 28, Bianca was the golden child, a social media influencer who treated life like a continuous luxury vacation. I was the outlier. I had dropped out of a prestigious historically Black university years ago because the financial burden became too much. While my parents eagerly paid for Bianca's designer bags and European trips, they told me character building meant paying my own tuition. Working 3 jobs while taking full course loads eventually broke my health and I had to leave school. Ever since that day, I was labeled the family failure. I started a landscape and floral design business from scratch. I worked with soil and plants, coming home with dirt under my fingernails, which disgusted my mother. The only person who truly loved me for me was my grandmother, Ruby. When she passed away, she left her beautiful historic Victorian home directly to me. It was a stunning property with wraparound porches and ancient oak trees. However, my parents immediately moved in, claiming they needed to manage the estate for me. Over the years, they simply took over, acting as if the house was theirs and treating me like an unwanted guest in my own inheritance. That Sunday evening, I pulled my dusty work truck into the long driveway of the Victorian estate. My hands were literally shaking on the steering wheel. Tucked safely inside the inner pocket of my denim jacket was a piece of paper that defied all logic. A Florida Lotto ticket worth $80 million. I had checked the numbers a dozen times sitting in the parking lot of a gas station. For the first time in my life, I felt a massive wave of hope. I genuinely believed this money could fix everything. I could pay off my father's hidden debts. I could fund my mother's charity events. I could finally be the daughter they respected. I walked through the heavy oak front doors with a genuine smile on my face. The smell of roasted chicken and collard greens wafted from the kitchen. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the booming laughter of my brother-in-law Preston coming from the formal dining room. Preston was a white crypto finance bro who had married Bianca 2 years ago. He constantly used his background and wealth to belittle me, wrapping his insults in polite corporate jargon. He was the type of man who specialized in microaggressions, always making sure I knew my place at the bottom of the social ladder. I stepped into the dining room ready to announce my news. The long mahogany table was set with Grandmother Ruby's best fine china. My father sat at the head of the table, chewing loudly on a piece of steak. My mother sat to his right, wearing a stiff silk blouse, her hair perfectly coiffed. Bianca was busy taking selfies with her phone ring light while Preston swirled an expensive glass of bourbon. "Look who finally decided to show up," my mother Vivica said without looking at me. She gestured vaguely toward the empty chair at the far end of the table. "Sit down, Harper. We have important family matters to discuss, and you are delaying the process." I took my seat, my hand instinctively brushing against the pocket containing my $80 million secret. I was just about to speak when my mother reached beside her plate and picked up a thick stack of legal documents. She slid them down the polished wood of the table until they stopped right in front of my plate. "What is this?" I asked, looking down at the bold legal heading. "It is a property transfer deed," my father Roland said, taking a gulp of red wine. "We have decided that the current living arrangement is no longer working. Bianca and Preston are celebrating their second wedding anniversary next month. Your mother and I agree that this house should be their anniversary gift. It is time for them to start a family in a proper estate." I stared at him, trying to process the sheer audacity of his words. "This house belongs to me," I stated, keeping my voice surprisingly calm. "Grandmother Ruby left it in my name." Preston chuckled, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Actually, Harper let us look at the reality of your financial capacity." He used that condescending tone he reserved exclusively for me. "You run a little lawn mowing service. You are out there cutting grass in the sun. The property taxes on an estate of this magnitude are astronomical. You lack the liquid assets to properly maintain a historic home. We are actually doing you a massive favor by taking this liability off your hands." I looked over at Bianca, who was admiring her fresh manicure. A flawless, intricate set of acrylic nails covered in tiny Swarovski crystals. Something clicked in my mind. Just 2 weeks ago, my mother had called me crying, saying she needed $2,000 for emergency medical bills because my father's insurance would not cover a vital procedure. I had emptied my business account to send her that money. Now, looking at Bianca's hands and the brand new diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist, I realized exactly where my hard-earned money had gone. They had bled me dry to fund her luxury lifestyle. My mother tapped her manicured fingernail against the table, demanding my attention. "Sign the papers, Harper. You are 31 years old, and you have nothing to show for it. You dropped out of college. You embarrass us at church with your dirty work boots. We cannot have you occupying an estate that Bianca and Preston can actually use to elevate the family name. You are a grown woman. Pack your things tonight and figure out your own life." The room fell completely silent. They were all staring at me, waiting for the usual reaction. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to cry and beg for their love, just as I had done since I was a teenager. They expected the broken girl who worked herself to the bone just to hear a single word of praise. But as I sat there breathing in the scent of the home my grandmother had loved, I felt a profound shift deep within my soul. I slid my hand into my jacket pocket and my fingertips traced the crisp edges of the lottery ticket. $80 million. Enough money to buy and sell every single person sitting at this table 10 times over. Enough power to crush the fake empire my parents had spent decades pretending to rule. I looked at my father, whose eyes were filled with impatience. I looked at my mother, whose face held nothing but cold disdain. I looked at Bianca, who was smirking as if she had already won. And finally, I looked at Preston, who was holding a gold-plated pen out to me, expecting me to sign away my only sanctuary. I did not yell. I did not throw my glass or cause a scene. I simply stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. The screech of the wood against the floor echoed in the quiet room. "If you all love this house so much, you can keep it," I said, my voice steady and light. "I really do not need it anymore." My mother frowned, clearly confused by my lack of resistance. "Are you being sarcastic with me, Harper? Because I will not tolerate disrespect in my home." "It is not your home, Vivica," I replied, dropping the title of mother for the first time in my life. "But consider it my parting gift to the illusion you all work so hard to maintain. Enjoy the property taxes, Preston. I am sure your crypto portfolio will cover it beautifully." I turned my back on them, leaving the unsigned documents on the table. I walked down the long hallway, my boots echoing on the hardwood floors. I did not stop to pack a single bag. I did not look back at the life I was leaving behind. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the humid Florida night air. When I climbed into my old truck, the engine sputtered before roaring to life. I pulled out of the driveway, leaving the glowing windows of the Victorian estate in my rearview mirror. As I drove down the dark palm tree-lined streets, an overwhelming sense of liberation washed over me. I pulled my truck into an empty parking lot overlooking the ocean and turned off the engine. I took the ticket out of my pocket and placed it on the dashboard. The numbers stared back at me, promising a future where I would never be a victim again. I pulled out my phone and searched for the most ruthless private wealth law firm in the country. I needed sharks who specialized in anonymous trusts and aggressive asset protection. I dialed the emergency after hours number for a firm based in Manhattan. A calm, professional voice answered on the third ring. "Good evening, you have reached the Executive Services line. How may I direct your call?" I took a deep breath, letting the reality of my new existence settle into my bones. "My name is Harper Davenport," I said, staring at the dark ocean waves. "I need to retain a senior partner immediately. I need to establish a blind corporate trust tonight. I just won $80 million, and I am going to buy my family." The line was quiet for a brief second before the operator responded with utmost urgency. "I am patching you through to our senior managing partner right now, Miss Davenport." I leaned back against the worn fabric of my truck seat and smiled. My family thought they had successfully discarded the weakest link. They believed they had completely destroyed my future by stealing my past. They had no idea that they had just given me the motivation I needed to orchestrate their absolute downfall. The game had just begun, and I was holding all the winning cards. The morning sun filtered through the cheap blinds of the motel room I had rented for the night. My phone vibrated endlessly on the bedside table. I picked it up to find 37 new messages from Bianca. She sent pictures of black garbage bags sitting on the wet grass of the front lawn. She typed that my cheap clothes were getting ruined in the morning dew and told me to come collect my trash before she called the city to haul it away. A few hours ago, those messages would have brought me to tears. I would have rushed over apologizing and begging for forgiveness. But today, I just looked at the screen and felt nothing but a quiet, profound sense of peace. I deleted the entire conversation and turned off my phone. I took a shower, dressed in my cleanest pair of work jeans, and drove my truck to the downtown financial district. The law firm I had contacted the night before occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper. I walked into the lobby feeling the weight of the stares from the receptionists in their designer suits. They looked at my scuffed boots and denim jacket with obvious disdain. But when I spoke my name, the senior managing partner practically ran out of his glass corner office to greet me. We sat in a private boardroom overlooking the ocean. Over the next 6 hours, my entire existence changed. We established a blind corporate trust to claim the $80 million lottery ticket, keeping my name completely out of the public records. I watched as the paperwork was finalized and the funds were securely transferred into a private wealth management account. The first purchase I made was not a sports car or a mansion. I bought a massive 3-story commercial building in the heart of downtown Miami, paying in cash. It would become the new luxury headquarters for my landscape and floral design firm. As we were wrapping up the financial transfers, my lead attorney slid a separate file across the table. He told me his security team had noticed some troubling digital activity. Preston, my arrogant brother-in-law, had been running illegal background checks using my social security number. He was desperately searching for unpaid taxes or hidden debts, trying to find a legal loophole to force a property seizure on the house of my grandmother. He wanted to ruin my credit and steal my inheritance right out from under me. I smiled at the lawyer and told him to let Preston keep digging. I wanted him to feel confident right until the ground crumbled beneath his feet. 2 days later, a heavy cream envelope arrived at my new temporary penthouse apartment. It was an invitation from my mother Vivica to the annual Diamond Charity Gala for the local university. It was the most exclusive event for the Black elite in South Florida. Included with the invitation was a handwritten note from my mother demanding that I provide all the floral centerpieces for the ballroom free of charge. She wrote that since I was now homeless and jobless, it was the least I could do to earn some exposure for my little gardening hobby. She told me to use the service entrance so I would not embarrass the family in front of the real guests. I picked up my phone and sent her a single text message saying I would be there. I spent the next 2 weeks orchestrating my silent metamorphosis. I hired an elite styling team and purchased a breathtaking emerald green designer gown that cost more than my first truck. I had my hair and makeup done by professionals who usually worked with celebrities. When the night of the Diamond Gala finally arrived, I did not drive my old work truck. I stepped out of a sleek black chauffeured Maybach and handed the valet my door pass. I walked into the grand ballroom and the atmosphere was electric. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the hundreds of wealthy guests. I spotted my family immediately. They were holding court near the center of the room. Vivica was wearing a silver dress and laughing loudly with the wives of local politicians. Roland was shaking hands and handing out business cards. Bianca and Preston were posing for the event photographers, trying to look like a power couple. I walked slowly toward their area, letting the silk of my emerald gown trail behind me. Bianca noticed me first. Her smile dropped, and her eyes widened in pure shock as she took in my appearance. She pulled on the sleeve of Preston's jacket and pointed in my direction. Preston looked at me and his face twisted into a sneer. He walked over and grabbed my arm, pulling me roughly out of the main walkway and into a dimly lit corner near the kitchen doors. Bianca and my mother followed close behind, looking around nervously to see if anyone had noticed us. My mother glared at me and demanded to know what I was doing parading around the main floor. She asked where the floral arrangements were and why I was wearing a cheap knockoff gown that was clearly rented. Preston laughed and told me I looked pathetic trying to fit in with people who actually mattered. He said I was a financial liability and a social embarrassment. He leaned in close and told me to take my cheap dress and go out back with the catering staff where I belonged before he had security throw me out. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I looked at Preston and then at my mother and told them to enjoy their evening because it would be a night they would never forget. I pulled my arm out of his grasp and walked away, leaving them fuming in the shadows. I walked directly to the front of the ballroom and took a seat at the primary VIP table right next to the university president. I could feel my family glaring at me from across the room, their faces red with fury at my defiance. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and the master of ceremonies took the stage. The crowd quieted down as he began his speech. He talked about the history of the university and the bright young minds that depended on the community for support. His voice grew heavy as he explained that the primary scholarship fund had been in severe danger of closing this year due to financial shortfalls. He paused, and a hush fell over the room. Then his face broke into a massive smile. He announced that just 3 days ago, an anonymous donor had stepped forward with a miraculous financial contribution. He said the donation had not only saved the scholarship program, but fully funded it for the next 20 years. The master of ceremonies raised his hand and pointed toward my table. He announced that the mysterious benefactor had agreed to reveal her identity tonight. He asked everyone to stand and welcome the new diamond sponsor of the university. He spoke my name into the microphone. Miss Harper Davenport. The spotlight swung through the darkness and landed directly on me. The entire ballroom erupted into a deafening standing ovation. Hundreds of wealthy investors, politicians, and community leaders rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. I stood up in my emerald gown and offered a gracious smile to the crowd. I looked across the sea of clapping hands and found my family. The sight of their faces was worth every single tear I had ever shed. My mother Vivica dropped her crystal champagne glass onto the marble floor. It shattered into dozens of pieces, but the sound was drowned out by the applause. Roland stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief. Bianca looked like she was going to be physically sick, her face pale and contorted with jealousy. Preston was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mind clearly racing to calculate how the sister-in-law he had just called a poor grass cutter could possibly afford to fund a massive university endowment. I walked up the steps to the stage, gracefully accepting the microphone from the master of ceremonies. I looked out over the crowd and delivered a brief, elegant speech about the importance of supporting Black excellence. I dedicated the endowment to the memory of my grandmother Ruby, the woman who taught me that true wealth grows from the roots up. I did not mention my parents. I did not look at them once during my speech. I thanked the university and walked off the stage to another roaring round of applause. The rest of the gala was a blur of handshakes and congratulations. Wealthy developers and politicians who had ignored me for years were suddenly lining up to introduce themselves and hand me their cards. My family tried to approach me several times, but they were constantly blocked by the crowd of important people clamoring for my attention. They were forced to watch from the sidelines as I became the center of the elite world they worshipped. When the gala finally ended, I made my way through the grand lobby toward the valet stand. I heard the frantic clicking of heels on the marble floor behind me. I turned to see Vivica, Roland, Bianca, and Preston rushing toward me. The hostility and disdain they had shown me in the dark corner 2 hours ago had completely vanished. My mother was actually crying tears of joy, reaching her arms out to hug me. She called me her beloved daughter and said she always knew I was destined for greatness. She told me how proud she was and asked why I had kept such a wonderful secret from my own family. Roland stepped forward with a wide fake smile, calling me his little girl and saying we needed to celebrate together immediately. Bianca forced a stiff smile and told me she loved my dress, pretending she had not insulted it just hours prior. Preston stood in the back, looking incredibly nervous, suddenly using a respectful tone as he suggested we sit down and discuss my investment portfolio. I looked at the four of them standing there wearing their greed and desperation like cheap cologne. I felt absolutely nothing for them. I took a deliberate step backward, ensuring the reaching arms of my mother grasped nothing but empty air. My sleek black Maybach pulled up to the curb. Two of my private security guards stepped smoothly between me and my family, forming an impenetrable physical barrier. My mother gasped and demanded the guards move out of the way, stating she was my mother. The guards did not even blink. I looked at Vivica, Roland, Bianca, and Preston one last time. I did not smile. I did not offer them a single word of comfort or explanation. I simply turned around, got into the luxurious leather back seat of my car, and let the driver close the door. I watched through the tinted glass as my family stood on the curb, arguing with each other as my car pulled away into the night. I woke up the next morning in my penthouse apartment feeling incredibly rested. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the ocean waves roll against the shore. I knew my display of wealth at the gala would trigger a reaction, but I underestimated the sheer depth of their malicious greed. There was a sharp knock at my front door. My security detail opened it to reveal a nervous-looking process server holding a thick stack of legal documents. My guard took the papers and brought them to me. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter and flipped open the heavy folder. I read the front page and a cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips. Fueled by greed after my public humiliation of them, my parents and Preston had spent the entire night contacting their corrupt legal connections. They had filed an emergency court petition for a legal conservatorship. The documents falsely claimed that I was mentally unstable, suffering from severe delusions, and completely incapable of managing my newfound wealth. They had petitioned a judge to grant them total and immediate control over my finances, my business, and my $80 million. They wanted to strip away my human rights and turn me into their personal bank account. I closed the folder and walked back to the window looking out at the city below. They had just declared a brutal, absolute war. They thought this conservatorship would paralyze me with fear. They did not know that by filing these papers, they had just handed me the key to their absolute destruction. I tossed the conservatorship petition onto the marble kitchen island. The thick stack of legal documents hit the stone surface with a heavy thud. My parents and Preston really thought they could declare me mentally incompetent and seize my $80 million. They thought I was still the exhausted college dropout who would crumble under the weight of their intimidation. But before I could even sit down to review the ridiculous claims they had filed, my phone began to vibrate violently against the counter. It was not just one text message. It was dozens arriving back-to-back in a rapid-fire sequence that made the device buzz like an angry hornet. I picked up the phone and saw my assistant had left 3 frantic voicemails. I opened my social media applications and immediately understood the panic. Bianca had gone live on her channels. She had perfectly orchestrated her performance to destroy my reputation. In the video, my sister was sitting on the floor of her massive walk-in closet, wearing an oversized gray hoodie. Her usually flawless makeup was entirely absent, and her hair was tied in a messy bun to make her look fragile and exhausted. She strategically positioned the camera so that her racks of designer shoes and luxury handbags were pushed out of the frame. She wanted to look like an ordinary girl suffering from a terrible family tragedy. She looked directly into the lens with tears streaming down her face, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her oversized sweater. She told her millions of followers a completely fabricated story about how her older sister had suddenly come into a massive amount of wealth and completely abandoned their struggling family. Bianca cried as she lied, saying I had drained our parents' retirement accounts to fund my new business and left them on the verge of bankruptcy. She begged her followers to pray for our family, claiming that I was experiencing a severe mental breakdown and refusing to get psychological help. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Bianca knew exactly how to play the victim, and the internet devoured her performance. Within hours, the video had gone viral across all platforms. The comments section was a war zone of strangers attacking my character. People were calling me a heartless monster, a greedy opportunist, and a disgrace to the Black community. The digital mob quickly found the business pages for my floral and landscape design firm. They flooded my accounts with one-star reviews and vile threats demanding that my clients boycott my services. I walked into my new corporate headquarters in downtown Miami the next morning. A small group of local reporters was already gathered outside the glass doors shouting questions at me as my security team escorted me inside. My staff was terrified. The phones were ringing off the hook with high-end clients wanting to cancel their floral contracts for upcoming charity events. They did not want to be associated with a woman who was trending online for abusing her elderly parents. My public relations manager rushed into my office holding a tablet. She begged me to release a statement immediately. She wanted to draft a press release defending my character and calling out Bianca's lies. I sat behind my custom mahogany desk and calmly told her no. I instructed my entire team to maintain absolute silence. They were to reroute the phones, ignore the press, and focus strictly on the work. I knew that engaging in a public screaming match with Bianca would only feed the media circus my family so desperately craved. I chose the power of silence, letting them shout into the void while I prepared my real counterattack. Later that afternoon, my lead wealth management attorney arrived at my office looking deeply concerned. We sat in the boardroom, and he placed a new file on the table. He explained that Preston had taken his legal harassment to the next level. Using his white privilege and his connections at the country club, Preston had managed to bypass standard legal protocols. He had played golf with a notoriously corrupt local judge named Carmichael. Over cigars and handshakes, Preston convinced the judge to sign an emergency temporary injunction freezing my personal operating accounts. The judge used the pending conservatorship petition as justification, claiming my assets needed to be frozen until my mental competency could be evaluated in court. Preston was trying to starve me out. He wanted to cut off my cash flow and force me to come crawling back to the family home, begging for mercy. My lawyer assured me that the blind corporate trust holding my $80 million was completely impenetrable. Preston and the corrupt judge could not touch the jackpot, but they had successfully frozen the working capital for my landscaping business. I did not panic. I simply nodded and told my lawyer to file the necessary appeals to keep them busy in court. Then I made a phone call to a man named Marcus. Marcus was a former federal agent who now ran an elite private intelligence firm. He specialized in forensic accounting and corporate espionage for the ultra-wealthy. He arrived at my office through the private parking garage an hour later. Marcus was a tall, imposing man who spoke very few words. We sat in my office and I slid a blank check across the desk. I told him I needed him to tear my brother-in-law's entire existence apart digit by digit. I wanted full access to Preston's crypto wallets, his offshore accounts, and his client investor lists. I told Marcus to look into every single transaction Preston had made since he married my sister. Then I pointed to the whiteboard where I had written the names of my parents, Vivica and Roland Davenport. I told Marcus to dig into their pristine facade. I wanted him to audit the church charity funds my mother managed. I wanted him to pull my father's real estate licenses and investigate every property deal he had brokered in the last 10 years. Most importantly, I told Marcus to find the original deed and mortgage history for my grandmother Ruby's Victorian house. I wanted to know exactly how my parents had managed to live so lavishly while constantly asking me for money. Marcus took the blank check, folded it neatly into his pocket, and left the room without a word. For the next 7 days, I endured a brutal media war without firing a single public shot. My mother, Vivica, went on a local morning television show, dressed in modest clothing, clutching a tissue. She wept for the cameras, talking about how she missed her sweet daughter Harper and just wanted to get me the medical help I so desperately needed. She painted herself as a heartbroken matriarch, trying to hold her family together against the destructive force of my sudden greed. Roland gave interviews to local business magazines talking about family values and the tragedy of new money destroying old traditions. Bianca continued to post daily updates, milking the drama for millions of views and securing new brand sponsorships fueled by the sympathy of her followers. My family thought they were winning. They mistook my silence for surrender. They believed their public shaming and the temporary freeze on my accounts had broken my spirit. I spent that week quietly working out of my office, designing a massive new botanical installation for a private client who did not care about internet gossip. I slept soundly every night in my penthouse, completely unbothered by the noise outside. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what was coming. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Marcus walked back into my office. He looked grim, but highly satisfied with his work. He walked over to my desk and dropped a heavy, thick manila folder right in the center of my workspace. He sat down in the leather chair opposite me and leaned forward. He told me I was entirely correct to trust my instincts. The facade my family had constructed was built on a foundation of massive criminal fraud. Marcus opened the file and began to walk me through his findings. He started with my arrogant brother-in-law. Preston was not a financial genius. He was not a successful crypto investor. The firm he boasted about was nothing more than a classic Ponzi scheme built on smoke and mirrors. Marcus had hacked into the blockchain data and discovered that Preston was running a massive fraud operation. He was aggressively recruiting new investors at his elite country club, promising them guaranteed astronomical returns on imaginary digital coins. But Preston was never actually investing their money into any legitimate cryptocurrency markets. He was simply taking the fresh cash from the new investors to pay off the older investors while skimming millions of dollars off the top. He used that stolen money to fund his luxury lifestyle, with Bianca buying sports cars and designer watches to maintain the illusion of extreme success. He had zero actual assets, and the entire scheme was on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. Preston's desperate attempt to freeze my accounts and seize my wealth through the conservatorship was not just greed, it was a frantic attempt to find capital to keep his illegal pyramid scheme from imploding. He needed my $80 million to pay off the furious investors who were starting to demand their returns. I smiled icily, tracing my finger over the pages of financial forensic data. Preston had called me a poor grass cutter, but he was nothing but a high-class thief drowning in imaginary digital coins. Then Marcus turned the page to the section regarding my parents. He pulled out a stack of documents related to grandmother Ruby's historic Victorian house. When my grandmother died, she left the property free and clear, exclusively in my name. My parents had moved in, claiming they were just keeping it safe for me while I built my business. But Marcus had uncovered the horrifying truth. 3 years ago, Roland and Vivica had forged my signature on a series of complex legal documents. Marcus detailed how my father Roland had used his insider knowledge of the local real estate market to bypass the standard verification checks. He had hired a corrupt notary public to stamp the forged deeds, making the entire illegal transfer look perfectly legitimate on paper. My mother Vivica had personally walked into the county clerk's office, smiling and chatting with the staff, while filing the fraudulent documents that stole my inheritance. They had then taken those fake deeds to a shadow lending group located in a dark office park on the outskirts of the city. Marcus explained that this group was essentially a network of ruthless loan sharks operating under the guise of a private equity firm. They specialized in high-interest predatory loans for desperate people who could not pass a standard background check. My parents had borrowed nearly $2 million against the house that rightfully belonged to me. And now Marcus said, tapping a red flag document, the bill has come due. My parents had completely defaulted on the loan. They had not made a single payment in 6 months. The shadow lending group was preparing to initiate a hostile foreclosure. They were going to seize the house and strip my family of everything. Roland and Vivica were drowning in debt and facing severe criminal charges for the forged signatures. Their support of the conservatorship was a desperate final play to steal my lottery winnings so they could pay off the loan sharks and avoid federal prison. I sat back in my chair staring at the devastating evidence laid out before me. My sister was crying on the internet for sympathy. My mother was weeping on television about family values. My father was posing as a pillar of the community. My brother-in-law was looking down his nose at my profession. Yet behind closed doors, they were all pathetic criminals hanging by a thread over a pit of absolute ruin. Marcus looked at me, waiting for my instructions. He asked if I wanted him to forward the files to the local authorities and have them all arrested immediately. I looked at the documents showing the defaulted loan on my grandmother's house. I realized in that moment that I did not just have to fight them in a courtroom. I did not have to waste time defending myself against their public lies. I had the power to own them completely. I looked at Marcus and told him not to call the police just yet. I had a much better plan. I picked up the phone to call my wealth management team, preparing to make a move that would trap my family in a cage of their own making. The line was ringing as I stared at the financial forensic documents Marcus had left on my desk. When my lead wealth management attorney answered, I did not exchange pleasantries. I told him to pull together a team of corporate acquisition specialists immediately because we were going shopping. The shadow lending group that held the fraudulent mortgage on my grandmother's house was notoriously aggressive. They were already filing the preliminary paperwork to initiate a hostile foreclosure. My parents were completely out of time. Their desperate conservatorship petition was currently stalled in the appellate courts thanks to my ruthless legal team, and the loan sharks do not wait for the justice system. Roland and Vivica realized they could not legally seize my money fast enough to save themselves, so they pivoted back to their favorite weapon, public manipulation. Bianca was already fighting a losing battle on the internet. After her initial tearful video went viral, a wave of independent content creators had started digging into her stories. People noticed the inconsistencies. They pointed out that her timeline of our family bankruptcy made no sense when compared to her constant posts about buying designer handbags and luxury vehicles. The internet is a brutal detective, and soon the tide began to turn. Users started demanding proof of my supposed mental breakdown. Bianca doubled down, posting frantic updates claiming I had hired thugs to threaten her and that she feared for her life. She thought her digital mob would break my spirit. Instead, I completely ignored her. I refused to create a single social media account to defend myself. My silence drove her absolutely insane because she thrived on attention and I was starving her of it. 2 days later, a heavy embossed envelope was delivered to my penthouse. It was an invitation to a special Sunday service at the massive South Florida megachurch my family attended. The enclosed note from the senior pastor claimed the service was dedicated to family healing and reconciliation. Pastor Miller wrote that my parents were heartbroken and simply wanted their daughter back in the fold. I knew exactly what it was. It was an ambush. They wanted to drag me into a sanctuary filled with 3,000 members of their elite social circle and publicly shame me into handing over the cash to save the family estate. They thought if they put me on the spot in front of God and the entire congregation, I would fold under the pressure and write a check just to escape the humiliation. I decided to give them exactly the audience they desperately wanted. When Sunday morning arrived, I did not dress in the modest, understated clothes my mother used to force me to wear. I wore a tailored, brilliant white designer suit that projected absolute authority and untouchable wealth. My private security team escorted me through the massive glass doors of the sanctuary just as the opening worship songs were concluding. The ushers immediately directed me to the front row where my family was sitting. Vivica wore a somber black dress clutching a lace tissue to her chest. Roland looked appropriately solemn with his head bowed. Bianca had her phone propped up on her designer purse, actively live streaming the service to her millions of followers. They were setting the stage for a viral moment of familial redemption. I took my seat at the end of their pew, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. Pastor Miller took the stage. He was a charismatic, polished man who loved the sound of his own voice and catered heavily to the wealthy donors of his congregation. Midway through his sermon, his tone shifted from uplifting to deeply serious. The dramatic music swelled softly in the background as he walked down the steps of the stage and stopped right in front of our pew. He looked directly at me, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. He spoke about the sacred duty of honoring thy father and mother. He told the silent congregation that the Davenport family was currently facing a terrible and unexpected financial hardship that threatened to destroy their historic family home. Then he aimed his full manipulative weight directly at my shoulders. He said that the Lord had recently blessed one member of this family with unimaginable wealth, and that it was a divine test of character to see if that wealth would be used to rescue her parents from the brink of ruin. He held out his hand to me and asked me to stand up and pledge my support to heal my family. The entire sanctuary was dead silent. 3,000 pairs of eyes were burning into the back of my head. Vivica let out a perfectly timed theatrical sob. Bianca angled her phone to capture my reaction, hoping to broadcast my submission to the world. They expected me to break under the immense social pressure. They expected me to weep and nod, and write a check to maintain my public image. Instead, I stood up slowly, buttoning my white suit jacket. I did not take the pastor's outstretched hand. I looked him dead in the eye, and my voice carried clearly through the quiet room without the need for a microphone. I asked Pastor Miller if honoring thy father and mother included turning a blind eye to massive mortgage fraud. A collective gasp rippled through the front pews. I kept my voice steady and cold. I told the pastor that before he used his pulpit to extort money from me, he should audit the charity funds my mother managed for his church because he might find his own financial hardships approaching very soon. I looked down at Vivica, who had turned ashen white, her tissue frozen halfway to her face. I looked at Roland, whose jaw was clenching in absolute panic. I told them all that God may forgive predatory loans and forged signatures, but I certainly do not. Bianca quickly lunged forward to knock her phone over, cutting off the live stream, but the damage was already done. The murmurs in the sanctuary were growing into a chaotic roar. The wealthy elites who had respected my father were now whispering fiercely among themselves. Pastor Miller stood frozen on the carpet, completely out of his depth. I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked up the center aisle, my security detail parting the sea of shocked churchgoers. I walked out into the bright Florida sunshine, feeling the heavy, oppressive chains of my family expectation finally shatter and fall away. When I climbed into the back of my Maybach, I immediately dialed my legal team. The public humiliation at the church was just the opening act. It was time for the main event. I ordered my wealth management lawyers to create a new blind shell corporation immediately. I wanted the corporate structure layered so deeply behind strict non-disclosure agreements and offshore holdings that no one would ever be able to trace it back to my name. I named the new entity the Ruby Heritage Trust. My lawyers worked through the night filing the necessary paperwork and moving capital through secure channels to fund the new corporation. Once the shell corporation was fully established and legally operational, I unleashed Marcus and my corporate acquisition specialists. Their target was the shadow lending group that held the illegal mortgage on the Davenport estate. These loan sharks were ruthless and dangerous, but at the end of the day, they were businessmen who preferred liquid cash over the messy, prolonged legal battle of a hostile real estate foreclosure. My lawyers approached them representing the anonymous Ruby Heritage Trust. We offered to buy the entire debt portfolio associated with Roland and Vivica Davenport, paying the principal balance in pure liquid cash. We did not ask for a discount. We just demanded absolute immediate ownership of the debt. The loan sharks did not hesitate. They knew the original deed was forged, and a legal foreclosure would likely trigger a massive federal investigation into their predatory lending practices. They wanted the toxic asset off their books as quickly as possible. The transaction was completed in less than 48 hours. Millions of dollars were quietly transferred from my private accounts into the shadow lenders' accounts. The massive stack of defaulted loan documents, forged deeds, and penalty notices were securely delivered to my corporate office in downtown Miami. I sat alone in my penthouse later that evening, spreading the legal documents across my massive dining table. The heavy parchment paper represented the complete sum of my parents' financial ruin. By purchasing the debt, I had not erased it. I had acquired it. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and traced my fingers over my father's forged signature. My family was sitting in that house right now, terrified that the loan sharks were coming to throw them out into the street. They had absolutely no idea that the shadow lenders were gone. They had no idea that overnight I had become their sole legal creditor. I held the mortgage. I held the power of life and death over their assets. I owned the very roof over their heads, and I was going to make sure they paid me back for every single thing they had stolen. The next morning, the Miami sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corporate headquarters. I had spent the last few weeks transforming the 3-story downtown building into a literal indoor jungle. The walls were covered in living moss, and rare tropical vines cascaded from the exposed industrial rafters. My floral and landscape design firm was no longer a small operation running out of a dusty truck. We were booking high-end commercial contracts left and right, and my team of 30 employees buzzed around the lower levels, perfectly executing my vision. I stood in my top-floor executive office, enjoying the quiet hum of success. The peace was shattered when my intercom buzzed. My head of security informed me that 2 women were causing a massive disturbance in the ground-floor lobby. Before he could even finish his sentence, I heard the shrill, unmistakable sound of my mother's voice echoing up the open glass staircase. She was demanding to see me immediately and threatening to have my entire security staff fired. Bianca was right behind her, crying loudly and complaining that her designer shoes were getting ruined by the humidity in my indoor greenhouse. I did not panic, and I did not rush downstairs to meet them. I simply told my security chief to let them up. I walked over to the massive teak table in the center of my office, where a collection of rare ghost orchids was waiting to be pruned. I picked up my silver botanical shears and began carefully snipping away the dead leaves. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open and slammed against the wall. Vivica and Bianca marched in looking like they had just stepped off a runway, but their faces were twisted with ugly, desperate anger. My mother stopped in the middle of the room and crossed her arms, looking around at the lush greenery and expensive artwork with obvious disgust. She asked how I could live with myself knowing my family was suffering while I sat in a luxury office playing with weeds. I did not look up from my orchid. I carefully snipped a yellowing stem and let it fall to the floor. I asked them what they wanted, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Bianca stepped forward and slammed her expensive leather handbag onto my desk. She started screaming about how the internet was ruining her life and how she was losing brand deals every single day because people thought she was a terrible sister. She said her stress levels were so high that she and Preston desperately needed a distraction to save their marriage. They had decided to throw a massive luxury vow renewal ceremony to show the world how strong and united they were. Bianca told me that the event was going to be covered by several major lifestyle magazines, and it was the perfect opportunity to fix the family image. My mother nodded in agreement, stepping closer to my desk. She told me that they had already booked the most exclusive waterfront venue in South Florida, but they needed liquid cash to cover the deposits. Vivica looked me dead in the eye and issued her ultimate demand. She told me they needed $500,000 transferred into their accounts by the end of the day. I finally stopped trimming the orchid. I laid the silver shears on the table and looked at the two women standing before me. The sheer audacity of their demand was almost suffocating. They had just filed a fraudulent legal petition to strip me of my human rights and seize my entire lottery fortune. They were actively trying to destroy my life in a court of law, and yet they felt entirely entitled to march into my business and demand $500,000 for a fake wedding. Viveka saw my hesitation and decided to play her trump card. She lowered her voice and put on a fake smile of maternal concern. She told me that if I wrote the check and funded the vow renewal, she and Roland would happily drop the conservatorship lawsuit. She promised they would call off their lawyers and tell the judge that my mental health had miraculously improved. She actually called it a family compromise, saying this was my final chance to make things right and be welcomed back into the Davenport fold. They were attempting to extort me right in my own office. They were holding my freedom hostage for a $500,000 party. They had no idea that I already owned the massive debt on their historic home. They had no idea that I held the power to throw them out into the street with a single phone call. They were playing checkers while I had already checkmated them in a game they did not even know we were playing. I picked up my shears and turned my attention back to the ghost orchid. I meticulously pruned a tiny brown root, letting the silence stretch out until the tension in the room became unbearable. Bianca started tapping her foot impatiently, demanding an answer. I told them I would be absolutely thrilled to attend the vow renewal ceremony. I said it sounded like a beautiful celebration of love and I would not miss it for the world. My mother's face lit up with a triumphant smile, thinking she had successfully broken me. Bianca clapped her hands together and immediately started listing off the bank routing numbers where I needed to wire the money. I let her finish her sentence before I dropped the hammer. I looked directly at Bianca and told her I was not giving them a single dime. I said they would not get $500,000, they would not get $5, and they would certainly not get a single cent of my $80 million fortune. I told them they could fund their own fake luxury party with the money Preston was supposedly making as a crypto genius. The triumphant smiles vanished from their faces instantly. Viveka turned bright red, her neck splotchy with pure rage. She started screaming that I was an ungrateful, selfish mistake. She told me the conservatorship would ruin my life and that I would end up locked in a psychiatric ward while they managed my money anyway. Bianca started crying real tears of frustration, yelling that I was ruining her life and that Preston would make sure my business was destroyed. I calmly pressed a button under my desk. 4 towering security guards entered my office immediately. I pointed at my mother and sister and told the guards to escort the trespassers out of my building and to call the police if they ever stepped foot on my property again. Viveka and Bianca screamed and cursed all the way down the glass elevator, but I just turned back to my orchid, perfectly content in the silence they left behind. Later that evening, I was sitting in my penthouse reviewing the new landscaping contracts when an email notification popped up on my private secure server. The sender address was encrypted, masking the origin location, but the subject line made my blood run cold. It simply read, "You have 3 days." I opened the email and found a threatening message clearly written by Preston. He did not sign his name, but the corporate jargon and arrogant tone were unmistakable. The email stated that my refusal to cooperate with the family was a fatal mistake. The anonymous sender claimed to have hired private investigators to dig up dirt on my business. They threatened to leak fabricated stories to the press, claiming my floral company used illegal labor and toxic chemicals. The email promised that if I did not wire the $500,000 by Friday, my reputation would be annihilated, and the judge handling the conservatorship would receive anonymous tips about my dangerous, erratic behavior. Preston thought he was untouchable. He thought his encrypted email would scare me into submission. He believed he was the smartest person in the room, hiding behind his computer screen while running his fraudulent crypto empire. He did not realize that I had Marcus, the former federal agent, sitting on a mountain of digital evidence proving Preston was a massive criminal. I did not reply to the threatening email. I did not call my lawyers to complain. I took a sip of my sparkling water and opened the secure file Marcus had provided me. The file contained thousands of pages of irrefutable evidence. There were screenshots of Preston's illegal offshore bank accounts. There were ledgers showing exactly how he was moving money from new investors to pay off old ones. There were emails proving he was knowingly defrauding the wealthy members of his country club. It was a perfectly documented roadmap of a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. I sat at my dining table and carefully organized the digital files into a single encrypted folder. I added a detailed summary explaining exactly how the fraud operated, highlighting the specific accounts where the stolen money was hidden. I made sure every single piece of evidence was perfectly aligned, making the case so incredibly easy that a first-year law student could prosecute it. I opened a secure, untraceable browser and navigated to the official tip line for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I selected the Division for White-Collar Crime and Corporate Fraud. I did not leave my name or any identifying contact information. I simply uploaded the massive encrypted folder and typed a brief message stating that a South Florida finance broker named Preston was currently running an active Ponzi scheme, defrauding dozens of prominent citizens. I hovered my finger over the mousepad, taking a moment to appreciate the gravity of what I was about to do. Preston had tried to steal my inheritance. He had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. He had threatened my business and insulted my intelligence. He had funded his luxury life with stolen money while telling me I was worthless. I clicked submit and watched the progress bar quickly fill the screen. The confirmation message popped up thanking me for my anonymous tip. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, feeling a slow, deep smile spread across my face. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not take multi-million-dollar fraud cases lightly. I knew that within a matter of hours, a team of federal agents would be reviewing the immaculate evidence I had just handed them on a silver platter. They would see the stolen funds, the fake crypto coins, and the massive web of lies Preston had constructed to maintain his illusion of wealth. Preston and Bianca wanted a massive vow renewal ceremony to show the world how perfect their lives were. They wanted the spotlight and the attention of high society. I had just guaranteed that they would get all the attention they could ever handle. I imagined the federal agents currently preparing their warrants and organizing their raid teams. The timing was going to be absolutely perfect. My family had pushed me to the absolute edge, assuming I would eventually fall. They had underestimated the quiet girl who spent her life working in the dirt. They did not understand that working in the dirt teaches you exactly how to bury things. I poured myself a glass of red wine and raised it to the empty room, making a silent toast to the absolute chaos that was about to descend upon the Davenport family. The trap was set, the doors were locked, and they were entirely out of time. The 3 days leading up to the vow renewal ceremony felt like the calm before a devastating hurricane. I spent that time in my penthouse watching the quiet updates from Marcus roll across my secure server. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had received my anonymous tip, and they were moving with terrifying speed. They had quietly subpoenaed all of Preston's bank records and secured warrants for his electronic devices. Meanwhile, my wealth management team had legally finalized my acquisition of the Davenport estate debt. I held the mortgage documents in a fireproof safe in my office. I owned the very ground my family walked on. I owned the walls that sheltered them and the roof over their heads. They were throwing a massive high society party on my property, using money they did not have to impress people who did not truly care about them. The sheer delusion of their existence was almost fascinating to witness. When Saturday evening arrived, the humid Florida air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive perfume. My family had transformed Grandmother Ruby's historic backyard into an absurd display of fake wealth. They had erected a massive clear glass tent over the lawn, crushing the delicate rose bushes my grandmother had spent decades cultivating. Crystal chandeliers were suspended from the ancient oak trees, casting harsh, bright light over the imported white orchids that Bianca had demanded. They had hired a massive string quartet and a fleet of private valets. It was a circus of vanity funded by credit card debt and a collapsing Ponzi scheme. I arrived precisely 1 hour late. I did not sneak through the service entrance as my mother had commanded in her previous letter. My chauffeured Maybach glided smoothly up the long, circular driveway and came to a stop directly in front of the main red carpet. I stepped out of the vehicle, and the flash of photographer cameras immediately illuminated the night. I had spent hours with my styling team preparing for this exact moment. I wore a custom couture gown made of heavy liquid gold silk that draped perfectly across my figure, catching every single reflection of the stage lights. I wore my natural hair in a massive, elegant crown, adorned with subtle diamond clips. I looked like absolute royalty, and I walked with the unshakable confidence of a woman who held the world in the palm of her hand. The local society reporters and wealthy investors standing near the entrance immediately turned their attention away from the step and repeat banner. They raised their cameras and pointed their lenses directly at me, whispering about the mysterious new diamond sponsor who had saved the university endowment. I walked down the red carpet offering polite nods and gracious smiles to the crowd. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Bianca standing near the ice sculpture. She was wearing a massive white lace ball gown that made her look like an over-decorated wedding cake. Her face was flushed with pure fury. This was supposed to be her night to shine for her social media followers. This was her grand vow renewal ceremony, meant to solidify her status as a wealthy young socialite. Instead, all the cameras were facing away from her. The wealthy elites she was desperate to impress were clamoring to get a good look at the woman she had spent her entire life calling a failure. Before I could reach the main reception area, my mother Vivica materialized out of the crowd. She grabbed my arm with her sharp, manicured fingers, her fingernails digging into my skin. Preston stepped up directly behind her, blocking my path to the VIP tables. My mother's smile was stretched tight across her face, hiding her rage from the surrounding guests. She leaned in close so only I could hear her. She told me I had a lot of nerve showing up looking like a cheap gold trophy to steal attention away from my sister. She said I was a selfish, pathetic child who could not stand to see anyone else be happy. Preston crossed his arms and let out a cruel, condescending laugh. He told me I could wear all the shiny fabric in the world, but I would always just be a dirty landscaper underneath. He said they had a very special place reserved for me, so I would not contaminate the real guests with my presence. I did not pull my arm away. I did not raise my voice or react to their insults. I simply smiled and told them to lead the way. Vivica and Preston escorted me away from the glowing glass tent and the beautiful centerpieces. They walked me past the tables filled with local politicians and prominent business leaders. We kept walking until the music faded and the harsh fluorescent lights of the catering setup came into view. They led me right to the swinging metal doors of the service kitchen. Tucked into a dark, hidden corner, right next to the noisy kitchen doors, was a small wobbly folding table. It did not have a crystal centerpiece or a silk runner. It just had a wrinkled white tablecloth and a few mismatched chairs. The catering staff was using it as a place to rest their feet and drink water between serving trays. There was a small cardboard sign resting on the table that read Table 13. Preston pointed to a plastic folding chair and told me to sit down. He said it was the perfect spot for me because I was so used to working with the help. He told me to stay out of sight and keep my mouth shut for the rest of the evening. Vivica sneered and told me not to eat too much of the catered food because they had not paid for my plate. They turned around and walked back toward the glamorous lights of the main tent, leaving me alone in the shadows by the kitchen. They thought they had successfully humiliated me. They thought seating me with the staff would break my pride and put me back in my place. They did not understand that I was far more comfortable sitting with hardworking people than I would ever be sitting with a crowd of shallow, wealthy frauds. I pulled out the plastic folding chair, smoothed the liquid gold silk of my gown, and sat down gracefully. The catering staff looked at me in absolute shock. A young waiter holding a tray of empty champagne flutes stared at my designer dress and asked if I was lost. I smiled warmly and told him I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I asked the catering manager for his name. He told me it was David. I reached into my small clutch purse, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to him. I told David I wanted a bottle of their absolute best vintage champagne brought directly to table 13, and I wanted enough glasses for everyone standing in the service area. Within minutes, David returned with a chilled bottle of crystal and a tray of flutes. I popped the cork myself and poured a glass for every single waiter, chef, and busboy taking a break in the corner. I stood up and raised my glass, offering a cheerful toast to the people who were actually doing the real work to make this ridiculous party function. The staff smiled and raised their glasses with me. We spent the next hour laughing and sharing stories. I learned about their families and their dreams. We drank expensive champagne and ate fresh appetizers right out of the kitchen. I was having the absolute time of my life. Every few minutes, I would catch Bianca looking over at my hidden corner. She kept stretching her neck, trying to see past the floral arrangements, expecting to find me crying alone in the dark. Instead, she saw me laughing loudly, surrounded by smiling people, looking like a glowing goddess enjoying a private party. The absolute joy radiating from table 13 was driving her insane. She was sitting at the head table covered in diamonds and surrounded by wealth, but she looked utterly miserable because she could not break my spirit. I took a sip of my champagne and glanced toward the front of the estate. Standing quietly in the shadows near the main wrought iron gates was the head of my private security detail. I caught his eye and gave him a very subtle nod. He tapped his earpiece and gave me a thumbs up in return. He was confirming that Marcus and his team were in position. The trap was fully primed and the timer was ticking down to 0. A sharp ringing sound echoed through the massive speakers in the glass tent. The string quartet stopped playing, and the guests took their seats. Roland stood at the grand podium in the center of the room, tapping his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The spotlight hit his face, highlighting the sweat gathering on his forehead. He gripped the edges of the podium, looking out at the crowd of wealthy elites with desperate, hungry eyes. He cleared his throat and began his speech. He talked about the long, proud legacy of the Davenport family. He spoke about honor and integrity and the heavy burden of carrying a prominent name in South Florida society. He projected the image of a successful patriarch steering his family through the challenges of the modern world. Then he turned his attention to Bianca and Preston, who were sitting at the front table holding hands for the cameras. Roland raised his glass to Preston. He praised his son-in-law, calling him an absolute titan of the financial industry. He told the crowd that Preston was a rare aristocratic genius who had single-handedly elevated the family portfolio to new astronomical heights. He said Preston was the savior of their estate, a man of brilliant vision and unmatched wealth. I sat at table 13, swirling the champagne in my glass and smiling. The sheer irony of my father's words was almost too sweet to bear. He was standing in front of 300 people praising a man who was actively stealing from half the guests in the room. He was calling a common criminal the savior of his estate while standing on grass that legally belonged to me. Roland was not finished. He needed to make himself look like a martyr, so he shifted his tone to something somber and regretful. He looked out over the crowd and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He said that sometimes, despite the best efforts of a loving family, a child can simply lose their way. He said some people lack the ambition to succeed in the corporate world and choose to spend their lives working in the dirt. He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. He told the guests that the Davenport family continued to pray for those who had fallen from grace, hoping they would one day find their minds restored and their hearts humbled. The wealthy guests murmured in sympathy. Vivica dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken mother perfectly. Bianca looked down at her hands, trying to look sorrowful. Preston smirked in my direction, entirely pleased with the public execution of my character. The crowd offered a round of polite applause as Roland finished his speech and stepped down from the podium. The string quartet began to play a soft, elegant melody, and the waiters rushed back onto the floor to serve the main course. I finished the last drop of champagne in my glass and set it down on the plastic folding table. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated, showing a single encrypted text message from Marcus. The message simply read, "The convoy has entered the neighborhood. They are 2 minutes away." I stood up from table 13, smoothing the golden silk of my gown. I slowly walked out from the shadows of the catering area and stepped directly into the main aisle of the glass tent. I did not rush. I walked with deliberate, measured steps, my heels clicking softly against the temporary wooden floorboards. Preston noticed me approaching, and his smug smile immediately returned. He thought I was finally coming to beg for mercy. He thought his father's speech had broken my resolve, and I was walking up to the front table to surrender. He nudged Bianca and pointed at me, whispering something in her ear that made her let out a cruel little laugh. Roland and Vivica turned around in their chairs, their faces pulled into identical expressions of arrogant victory. I stopped walking when I was exactly 10 feet away from their table. I stood perfectly still, the light from the crystal chandeliers catching the diamonds in my hair. I looked directly into Preston's eyes. I did not say a word. I simply raised my hand, holding my phone so he could see it. I held his gaze, my expression completely devoid of mercy. I raised my other hand and held up 5 fingers. Preston's smug smile faltered slightly. He looked confused, glancing at my mother to see if she understood what I was doing. Vivica frowned, gripping the edge of the table. I folded my thumb down, leaving 4 fingers raised. I mouthed the number 4 silently, my eyes never leaving Preston's face. Roland stood up from his chair, his face flushing red. He pointed a finger at me and opened his mouth to shout an insult, demanding that I stop making a scene. I folded another finger down. I mouthed the number 3. A heavy, unnatural silence began to spread through the front half of the tent as the guests realized something strange was happening. Bianca stopped laughing. Her hands began to shake as she looked from me to the entrance of the tent. I folded my index finger down. I mouthed the number 2. Preston suddenly looked pale. The arrogant confidence drained out of his posture like water from a shattered glass. He looked down at his own phone, which had just begun to vibrate aggressively on the table. I folded my last finger down, forming a tight fist. I mouthed the number 1. Before Preston could even reach for his ringing phone, the peaceful melody of the string quartet was completely obliterated by the deafening shriek of multiple heavy sirens. Red and blue police lights exploded through the clear walls of the glass tent, casting chaotic, frantic shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. The deep, aggressive roar of armored federal vehicles echoed up the long driveway, tearing through the manicured lawns and coming to a violent stop directly in front of the main reception area. I stood perfectly still in my golden gown, smiling a cold, ruthless smile, as the heavy doors of the ballroom crashed open. The real party had finally arrived, and my family was about to discover exactly what happens when you try to bury a seed that was born to destroy you. The heavy doors of the glass tent crashed open, and the sharp red and blue lights painted the horrified faces of the wealthy guests. Preston was still standing near the podium, holding his crystal champagne flute, his mouth hanging open in absolute confusion. He had just finished listening to my father praise his financial genius, and now he was staring at a dozen men and women wearing dark tactical jackets bearing the golden letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Before anyone could even process the violent interruption, the massive LED screens behind the head table suddenly flickered. The screens were supposed to play a highly edited romantic video montage showing Bianca and Preston traveling the world on luxury yachts. Instead, the soft romantic music abruptly cut out and the screens went entirely black for a fraction of a second before flashing back to life with a completely different presentation. Marcus had timed the digital assault perfectly. He had hacked into the venue's audio-visual system and bypassed their security protocols with absolute ease. The giant screens towering over my family now displayed high-resolution images of Preston's actual financial reality. The first slide was a certified federal bankruptcy filing showing a completely zeroed-out balance sheet. The affluent crowd gasped as the screen shifted to display a complex web of offshore banking transfers, highlighting exactly how Preston had been funneling money out of his clients' accounts to pay for his luxury sports cars and Bianca's designer wardrobe. The forensic accounting was laid out so clearly that even the most oblivious socialite in the room could understand it. Preston was not a financial titan, he was a parasite bleeding them all dry. I stood in the center aisle watching the realization wash over the 300 guests. Many of these people were members of the elite country club where Preston had aggressively recruited his investors. They were staring up at the massive screens, seeing their own names and their own stolen investment funds listed in stark black and white text. The polite whispers of high society instantly dissolved into a chaotic roar of outrage and panic. Men in expensive tuxedos were pulling out their phones, frantically trying to check their investment portfolios. Women were shouting and pointing at the stage, dropping their expensive crystal glasses onto the floorboards. The elegant vow renewal ceremony had turned into a terrifying crime scene in a matter of seconds. Preston dropped his crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the wooden stage, sending sharp shards of glass scattering across the floor. He stumbled backward, his face draining of all color, until he looked completely ghostly. He grabbed the microphone and tried to stammer out a frantic excuse. He practically screamed into the sound system, claiming that it was all a terrible misunderstanding and a vicious cyber attack orchestrated by his jealous competitors. His voice cracked with raw panic echoing over the angry shouts of the betrayed investors. He looked like a cornered rat frantically searching the room for an exit, but the federal agents had already secured every single perimeter door, blocking any chance of escape. The lead federal agent marched straight down the center aisle, ignoring the chaotic crowd and heading directly for the raised stage. He did not hesitate, and he did not care about the expensive imported floral arrangements blocking his path. He stepped up onto the stage, grabbed Preston by the shoulder of his custom-tailored tuxedo, and forcefully spun him around. The sound of heavy metal handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the hot microphone that Preston had just dropped. The agent loudly declared that Preston was under arrest for massive wire fraud, money laundering, and the operation of an illegal Ponzi scheme. The final image flashed onto the giant LED screens behind them, displaying the official federal arrest warrant bearing Preston's full legal name. Preston began to cry. The arrogant, aristocratic genius who had spent the last 5 years telling me I was nothing but a dirty landscaper was now weeping like a terrified child. His knees buckled, and he refused to walk, so 2 federal agents had to physically grab him by the arms and drag him off the stage. They hauled him down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes dragging uselessly across the floorboards. The wealthy guests he had stolen from shouted vile insults at him as he passed by, completely destroying his pristine reputation in a matter of minutes. He was a fraud, and the entire world was finally watching him fall. Bianca was frozen at the head table, her massive white lace gown spilling around her like a deflated parachute. She stared in absolute horror as the federal agents dragged her husband out of the glass tent and shoved him into the back of an armored vehicle. Her perfect luxury lifestyle had just evaporated right before her eyes. The brand deals, the social media followers, the wealthy status. It was all built on stolen money, and it was all gone. She slowly turned her head and looked down the center aisle. Her eyes locked onto me, standing perfectly calm in my liquid gold silk dress. She saw the cool, satisfied smile on my face, and she instantly knew that I was the one who had orchestrated her destruction. A primal, unhinged scream ripped from Bianca's throat. She completely lost her mind. She kicked her chair back so violently it crashed into the table behind her, sending expensive silverware clattering to the floor. She gathered the heavy layers of her white gown in her hands and sprinted down the aisle, charging directly at me. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure demonic rage. She raised her hand, preparing to slap me across the face and tear my hair out. She wanted to physically hurt me to make me feel a fraction of the immense pain and humiliation she was currently experiencing. I did not flinch and I did not step back. I just kept smiling because I knew she would never even get close to me. Before Bianca could even close the 10-foot gap between us, my private security detail moved with terrifying speed. The towering guard I had signaled earlier stepped smoothly in front of me, forming an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. Bianca slammed directly into his chest, bouncing off him like a fragile bird hitting a thick glass window. She stumbled backward, tripping over the heavy hem of her own dress, and fell hard onto the wooden floorboards. She sat there on the ground, weeping hysterically and screaming that I had ruined her life. She pounded her fists against the floor, throwing a massive temper tantrum in front of the hundreds of horrified guests who were still filming the entire disaster on their phones. Roland and Vivica rushed down from the stage, their faces pale and slick with panicked sweat. They knelt beside Bianca, trying to pull her up from the floor, but she refused to move. My mother looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute hatred. The Grand Society matriarch who had spent the last month playing the victim on local television was completely exposed. Her pristine family image was shattered beyond repair. Her golden son-in-law was a federal criminal. Her perfect daughter was screaming on the floor, and her wealthy friends were currently watching her entire world burn to ash. Roland stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He told me I was a monster and a disgrace to the Davenport name. He screamed that I had maliciously orchestrated this public humiliation just to punish them for loving me. He said I was entirely dead to him, and that he would never forgive me for bringing federal agents into his home. He puffed his chest out, trying to reclaim some tiny shred of his broken authority, while the catering staff watched from the corner. Vivica joined in, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing through the chaotic glass tent. She told me I had destroyed my own family out of pure petty jealousy. She claimed I was a miserable, bitter woman who could not stand to see anyone else succeed. She ignored the giant LED screens still glowing with the undeniable proof of Preston's massive financial crimes, and instead focused all of her toxic venom entirely on me. She wrapped her arms around the sobbing Bianca, shielding her precious youngest daughter from the brutal reality of their collapsed empire. My mother stood up, grabbing Roland by the arm. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred and pointed toward the broken doors of the glass tent. She screamed at me to get out of her sight. She demanded that I take my security guards and leave their property immediately. She yelled at the top of her lungs, telling me to get off their grass and get out of their house, because I was no longer welcome there. She thought she still held the high ground. She thought she still possessed the absolute authority to banish me from the family estate, just like she had done so many times before. She screamed, "Get out of my house," over and over again, her voice cracking with hysterical rage, while the remaining guests watched in stunned silence. I just stood there letting her exhaust her lungs, because she had absolutely no idea that she was standing in a house she no longer owned. The silence that followed my mother's hysterical screaming was thick and suffocating. The guests were completely frozen in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between my calm expression and the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the clear glass walls of the tent. They had just watched the golden son-in-law get dragged away in handcuffs, and now they were watching the matriarch of the family lose her mind. I let Vivica scream until her voice cracked and she was gasping for breath. She stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to bow my head and retreat, just like I had done so many times when I was a terrified younger woman. But I did not move a single inch. I raised my hand and offered a subtle signal toward the back of the tent. Stepping out from the shadows near the catering entrance was my lead wealth management attorney. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and carried a thick, heavy leather briefcase that held the entire future of the Davenport family. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing clearly through the massive, quiet room. The affluent guests instinctively parted for him, sensing the absolute authority he carried. Roland watched the attorney approach, and his face began to twitch with a new kind of terror. Roland knew exactly what a high-powered corporate lawyer looked like, and he knew this was not a social visit. The attorney reached the front of the stage and handed me the heavy briefcase without saying a word. I took it from him and walked slowly up the 3 wooden steps onto the raised platform. I stood perfectly centered behind the grand podium, standing on the exact spot where my father had stood just minutes before, when he was praising a federal criminal and taking pathetic jabs at my character. I adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of terrified, wealthy elites, and then I looked down at my parents. I told my mother that her demand for me to leave her property was incredibly amusing, considering she did not own a single blade of grass on this entire estate. I unlatched the briefcase and pulled out the massive stack of legal documents. It was the complete debt portfolio containing the defaulted notices, the forged deeds, and the hostile foreclosure filings from the Shadow Lending Group. I held the thick stack of paper high in the air, so the bright stage lights could catch the heavy legal seals stamped on the front pages. Then I tossed the entire stack over the edge of the podium. The heavy file hit the wooden floorboards with a loud, aggressive smack, scattering hundreds of pages directly at Roland and Vivica's feet. I leaned into the microphone and let my voice carry through the silent tent. I told the crowd exactly what my parents had done behind closed doors. I explained that 3 years ago, Roland and Vivica had forged my signature on complex legal documents to steal my inheritance. I laid out precisely how my father had taken those fraudulent deeds to a network of ruthless loan sharks and borrowed nearly $2 million against Grandmother Ruby's historic house just to fund their pathetic illusion of high society wealth. The guests began whispering frantically among themselves. The very people Roland had spent years trying to impress, the politicians and business leaders he played golf with, were now staring at him with absolute disgust. They were looking at a man who would steal from his own daughter to buy luxury cars and country club memberships. I did not stop there. I told the entire room that my parents had completely defaulted on that illegal loan 6 months ago. I explained that the Shadowlanders had been days away from initiating a hostile foreclosure and throwing the great Davenport family out into the street. I looked directly into my father's eyes and watched his entire world violently crumble as the truth was dragged out into the unforgiving light. I told them that the mysterious corporate entity that swooped in and bought the massive debt portfolio from the loan sharks was not a foreign investor or a private equity firm. I told them that the entity was my real estate firm. I told them I had purchased their debt in pure liquid cash. I gripped the edges of the podium and let my final declaration echo through the tent. I announced that as of this exact second, I was the sole legal creditor and the absolute owner of this entire estate. Vivica let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Roland stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck, falling heavily against a decorative floral arrangement and knocking white orchids onto the floor. Bianca stopped her hysterical sobbing and just stared blankly at the scattered legal documents, her expensive makeup smeared across her face in thick black lines. They had spent months treating me like a disposable nuisance, trying to lock me in a psychological cage to steal my money, while they were secretly living on borrowed time and stolen property. I stepped away from the podium and walked down the stairs, stopping right in front of the shattered remains of my family. I looked at the towering security guards who had effortlessly blocked Bianca's attack earlier and gave them a single nod. The guards stepped forward immediately, forming a tight, intimidating circle around Roland, Vivica, and Bianca. I looked down at my mother, whose face was now pale and slick with terrified tears. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. I told them they had exactly 30 minutes to pack their personal belongings and get off my property. I kept my voice icy and completely devoid of emotion, so they understood I was not negotiating. I told them they could take their clothes and their personal items, but if they tried to remove a single piece of furniture, a single painting, or a single fixture, my security team would physically drag them out the front door. Roland tried to speak, his voice shaking and incredibly weak. He begged me to be reasonable, claiming they had nowhere to go and absolutely no money to their names. He pleaded with me, saying I could not possibly throw my own flesh and blood out into the night like common criminals. He tried to invoke the family bond that he had spent his entire life destroying. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile and pointed to the scattered foreclosure documents resting near his expensive shoes. I told him that if they were not completely off my property in exactly 30 minutes, I would take the forensic evidence of their forged signatures and hand it directly to the police department. I reminded them that forgery and massive bank fraud carried severe federal prison sentences and that Preston would likely be looking for cellmates to keep him company. Vivica began to wail a horrible, desperate sound of total defeat. She grabbed Bianca's arm and hauled her up from the floor, dragging the heavy, ruined white lace gown behind them. They did not try to argue anymore. They saw the absolute finality in my eyes, and they finally understood that the game was entirely over. They scrambled past the silent, judging faces of their former friends, keeping their heads down in absolute shame as they rushed toward the main house to pack whatever they could carry. I stood under the bright crystal chandeliers of the glass tent, breathing in the warm evening air. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers were finally fading in the distance, carrying Preston away to face his inevitable ruin. The affluent guests were quietly filtering out of the tent, whispering feverishly to one another as they headed for the valet stand. They had come dressed in their finest clothes to witness a grand vow renewal, and instead they had watched an entire empire of lies burn straight to the ground. I turned around and looked at the beautiful historic home my grandmother had built. The noise and the chaos were finally clearing, leaving only the peaceful, satisfying silence of absolute victory. They had only taken a dozen steps toward the grand double doors of the main house before the absolute reality of their situation finally crushed them. Roland stopped dead in his tracks, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the manicured grass. He looked up at the massive white columns and the glowing windows of the estate he had pretended to own for decades. He slowly turned around to face me. The arrogant patriarch who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless was trembling violently. The heavy wooden doors of the house behind him were guarded by two of my security personnel, who stood with their arms crossed, blocking the entrance until I gave the command. Vivica realized they were trapped. She looked frantically at the remaining guests who had lingered near the valet stand. Every single one of her wealthy friends, her country club rivals, and her society peers had their phones raised high in the air. The bright glow of camera lights illuminated the dark lawn, capturing every single agonizing second of her downfall. They were live streaming the complete destruction of the Davenport Empire to the entire world. The social media accounts that Bianca had spent years carefully curating with fake luxury brand deals and stolen wealth were currently exploding with comments from thousands of people who were watching the live feed of her federal criminal husband and her bankrupt parents. The humiliation was too much for Roland to bear. His knees buckled beneath the weight of his massive failures, and he collapsed onto the damp grass right in front of the glowing glass tent. The crisp knees of his custom-tailored tuxedo absorbed the mud and dirt. He held his hands out toward me, palms facing upward in a gesture of pure, absolute defeat. He wept openly, his tears catching the harsh glare of the camera lights. He begged me to show him mercy. He pleaded with me, saying he was an old man who had made terrible mistakes, and that throwing him out into the street would kill him. Vivica dropped to the ground right beside him, destroying her designer silk gown in the mud. The great society matriarch was on her knees sobbing and reaching out toward the hem of my liquid gold dress. She begged me to remember that she was my mother. She cried out, telling me that she had given me life and that a daughter could not possibly condemn her own mother to homelessness and poverty. She wailed about the embarrassment and the shame, saying that she would do anything I wanted if I just let them stay in the guest house. She promised she would scrub the floors and wash my clothes if I just showed them a tiny fraction of human decency. Bianca was still sitting on the wooden floorboards of the tent, clutching her ruined white lace ball gown and watching her parents beg for their lives. She was completely broken. Her phone was buzzing relentlessly on the floor next to her, lighting up with thousands of hateful messages from investors whose life savings had just been obliterated by her husband. The internet was violently tearing them apart. Every local news outlet was already running the story of Preston's arrest and the spectacular collapse of the fake Davenport fortune. Their names were permanently ruined. They would never be invited to another gala or another charity dinner. They would be outcasts, pariahs in the very society they had worshipped. I looked down at Roland and Vivica groveling in the dirt at my feet. I felt absolutely zero pity. My heart was a stone fortress locking out any trace of mercy or forgiveness. I looked at Vivica's tear-stained face and my mind flashed back to a busy international airport 15 years ago. I remembered being a terrified 15-year-old girl standing near Gate 24, watching my mother hand me a worthless sum of cash before turning her back on me to go live a life of luxury with her new husband. I remembered the cold, casual shrug she gave me as she walked away, leaving me to fend for myself in a world that did not care if I lived or died. I slowly unclasped my small designer clutch purse. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I held it between my fingers, letting the warm Florida breeze catch the edges of the paper. I looked directly into Vivica's desperate, weeping eyes. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure my words carried enough weight to shatter her soul. I told her that she was a grown woman and she could figure it out. I opened my fingers and let the $20 bill flutter down through the humid air until it landed directly on the wet grass right in front of her muddy knees. I gave my final command to the security team. I told them to escort the former owners into the house and give them precisely 30 minutes to pack a single suitcase of clothing each. I explicitly instructed my guards to search every bag and empty their pockets to ensure they did not steal a single piece of jewelry, a single watch, or a single cent of cash that now legally belonged to my real estate firm to pay off their massive defaulted debts. The towering guards moved forward instantly, pulling Roland and Vivica up from the mud by their arms. My parents did not fight back. The fight had been completely beaten out of them. They hung their heads in absolute shame as the guards marched them toward the front doors of the estate. Bianca was dragged up from the tent floorboards by another guard, who forced her to walk up the long driveway in her shredded white gown. The wealthy guests who had once kissed the ground my mother walked on parted ways to let the disgraced family pass by, whispering cruel insults and continuing to film their humiliating retreat. I stood alone on the manicured lawn, watching the dark windows of the upper floors light up as my security team followed my family from room to room. I imagined the frantic, pathetic panic taking place inside the house. I pictured Vivica weeping as she was forced to leave behind her expensive furs and designer handbags, packing only basic necessities into a cheap canvas suitcase under the watchful, unblinking eyes of my armed guards. I envisioned Roland staring at the walls of his grand office, realizing that his legacy was nothing more than a hollow lie built on stolen money and shattered lives. The 30 minutes passed with agonizing slowness for them and absolute delicious satisfaction for me. I remained standing on the lawn, letting the cool night breeze brush against my skin. The local police cruisers had finally cleared out, leaving the estate strangely quiet, except for the low murmur of the remaining guests, who were eagerly waiting to watch the final act of this incredible tragedy. The heavy mahogany front doors of the estate swung open. The bright interior light spilled out onto the dark driveway, illuminating the pathetic silhouettes of my family. Roland emerged first, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his posture completely bent and broken. He dragged a single black suitcase behind him, the wheels rattling loudly against the stone pavement. He did not look up, and he did not make eye contact with anyone. The proud patriarch was nothing more than a ruined old man walking into the darkness. Vivica followed closely behind him. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess, and her muddy dress hung off her frame like dirty rags. She clutched a small duffel bag to her chest, her shoulders shaking with silent, uncontrollable sobs. She took one last look back at the grand foyer of the house she had stolen from me, hoping for some kind of last-minute miracle that would save her from the nightmare of poverty. A security guard simply stepped forward and slammed the massive double doors shut right in her face, severing her connection to the luxury world forever. The loud booming sound of the heavy locks engaging echoed across the property, sealing her fate. Bianca was the last to walk down the driveway. She had somehow managed to change out of her ruined wedding gown and was now wearing simple dark sweatpants and a hooded sweatshirt. She dragged a small rolling bag, her face hidden beneath the hood to avoid the glaring lights of the cell phone cameras still pointed in her direction. She knew her husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, and she knew her bank accounts were frozen solid. She was stepping out into a world where she had no skills, no money, and absolutely no friends. They walked past me in a slow, miserable procession. I did not offer them a goodbye. I did not gloat or hurl insults at their retreating backs. My silence was far more punishing than any words I could have spoken. I just watched them walk down the long, winding driveway toward the heavy wrought iron front gates of the estate. They had no cars, because the luxury vehicles parked in the garage were all leased under Preston's fraudulent company and were scheduled to be seized by federal authorities in the morning. They had to walk the entire length of the property on foot, carrying their cheap bags, dragging their feet through the humid night air. When they finally reached the edge of the property, my security team closed the massive iron gates behind them. The heavy metal clanged shut with a terrifying finality, locking them out on the dark, lonely street. They stood there on the pavement under the flickering light of a single street lamp, three broken shadows cast out of their own fake empire. They had absolutely nowhere to go and no one left to manipulate. The ultimate eviction was complete, and I had finally reclaimed everything that was rightfully mine. I turned my back on the gates, smoothed the heavy silk of my golden gown, and walked slowly back toward my beautiful historic house, leaving them to disappear into the unforgiving darkness of the city they once claimed to rule. The heavy oak doors of Grandmother Ruby's house closed softly behind me, shutting out the cold night air and the last lingering traces of my toxic family. I stood in the grand foyer, breathing in the scent of aged wood and memories. For the first time in my entire life, the massive estate was completely silent. There were no harsh criticisms echoing down the hallways, and no extravagant parties being planned with stolen money. The house belonged to me, and it was finally at peace. The next few months unfolded exactly as Marcus had predicted. The federal investigation into Preston's financial crimes was swift and absolutely merciless. The prosecution laid out a mountain of undeniable evidence showing exactly how he had drained the life savings of hundreds of trusting investors to fund his own arrogant lifestyle. Preston tried to turn on everyone. He wept in the courtroom and blamed his partners. He blamed the volatile market, and he even tried to blame Bianca for demanding such an expensive standard of living. The federal judge did not buy a single word of his pathetic performance. Preston was handed a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The aristocratic genius was reduced to a miserable inmate wearing a bright orange jumpsuit stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his fake prestigious title. Bianca's spectacular downfall was almost poetic to witness. She immediately tried to launch a massive victim campaign on social media, posting tearful videos claiming she had absolutely no idea her husband was a criminal. She begged her followers to support her and buy her branded merchandise so she could survive this terrible ordeal. The internet responded with absolute brutal honesty. Former investors flooded her comments with pictures of their depleted bank accounts demanding their money back. Every single one of her luxury brand sponsors dropped her within 48 hours, issuing public statements condemning her involvement in the fraud. Her massive follower count plummeted, and her glamorous influencer career evaporated into nothing. With her bank accounts frozen and her reputation completely destroyed, Bianca was forced to face the real world for the very first time in her pampered life. The last time I checked on her whereabouts, my private investigators informed me that she had taken a job at a local fast food drive-thru. The girl who had worn a custom lace ball gown to mock me was now wearing a stained polyester uniform, smelling of stale grease and handing out cheap hamburgers through a sliding glass window. She lived in a tiny rented room and spent her breaks crying over the life she had thrown away. Roland and Vivica fared no better in the harsh reality of their new, impoverished existence. The massive debt they had accumulated finally crushed them entirely. They were forced to move into a rundown one-bedroom apartment in a decaying neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. The walls were thin, the plumbing leaked, and the air conditioning barely worked. Their former society friends treated them like they carried a highly contagious disease. The elite country club where my father had spent decades puffing out his chest formally revoked their lifetime membership and permanently banned them from the property. Even their prominent society church quietly asked them to stop attending services, citing the massive distraction their presence caused among the congregation. They were completely ostracized from the only world they had ever valued. They spent their days trapped in that tiny, cramped apartment, bitterly arguing over grocery bills and blaming each other for their spectacular ruin. They had spent their entire lives treating everyone around them like disposable garbage, and now they were utterly alone with nothing but their own toxic company to keep them warm. While my family withered away in the shadows of their own making, I spent my time bringing Grandmother Ruby's estate back to life. I poured millions of dollars into fully restoring the historic property. I ripped up the dead grass where the ridiculous glass tent had stood and hired a team of expert botanists to carefully replant the delicate rose bushes my mother had so carelessly crushed. The house was completely updated and modernized, but it retained all the classic elegance and warmth that my grandmother had originally intended. It was no longer a cold museum used to impress shallow socialites. It was a living, breathing sanctuary. When spring arrived, the Florida air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and fresh rain. The estate was finally ready to be unveiled to the world, but this time the guest list was entirely different. There were no corrupt politicians, no greedy hedge fund managers, and no fake influencers posing for cameras. Instead, the sweeping green lawns were filled with bright young scholars, proud families, and dedicated educators. I had officially transformed the massive property into the headquarters for the Ruby Foundation. I used a significant portion of my $80 million fortune to establish a permanent endowment designed to provide full-ride academic scholarships for young Black women attending historically Black colleges and universities. I wanted to take the wealth that my family had tried to use for vanity and greed and turn it into a powerful engine for education and genuine opportunity. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was the most beautiful event the estate had ever seen. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm golden glow over the restored brick pathways and the vibrant floral gardens. A talented string quartet played uplifting, joyful music, while catering staff served incredible food to hundreds of smiling guests. It was a celebration of genuine achievement and limitless potential. I stood backstage watching the young scholarship recipients laughing and taking photos with their proud parents. They were brilliant, driven women who were going to change the world, and I had the absolute honor of helping them cross the starting line. My lead attorney, Marcus, stood next to me, looking out at the happy crowd. He handed me a bottle of sparkling water and offered a warm, sincere smile, telling me that Grandmother Ruby would be incredibly proud of what I had built. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound sense of peace settle into my bones. The event coordinator signaled that it was time for my speech. I walked out onto the beautiful wooden stage that had been built right in front of the main house. The crowd immediately quieted down, turning their attention to the podium. I did not wear a heavy liquid gold silk gown this time. I wore a beautifully tailored emerald green suit that made me feel strong, capable, and completely grounded. I stepped up to the microphone and looked out at the sea of hopeful, inspiring faces. I told them the story of my grandmother Ruby. I spoke about her fierce determination, her unwavering kindness, and the massive legacy she had left behind. I did not mention Roland, Vivica, or Bianca. They did not deserve to be part of this narrative anymore. They were simply ashes blown away by the wind, while we were busy planting new blossoms. I told the young women in the audience that the world would often try to tell them who they were supposed to be. I warned them that people would try to tear them down, underestimate their intelligence, and place them in boxes designed to keep them small. I gripped the edges of the podium and let my voice ring out clear and strong. I told them that true worth is never determined by toxic people who seek to exploit your light. True worth is built in the quiet moments of relentless dedication when you refuse to surrender your dignity to those who do not understand your value. I looked at the brilliant young scholars and told them they possessed the undeniable strength to stand tall and flourish amidst any storm the world could possibly throw at them. The crowd erupted into massive, genuine applause. The sound washed over me, filling the historic estate with pure, positive energy. I stood at the podium looking at the beautiful restored house and the thriving rose bushes swaying gently in the breeze. I possessed an $80 million empire, a thriving real estate firm, and a legacy that would change thousands of lives. But as I smiled out at the cheering crowd, I realized that the money and the power were just secondary details. The real prize, the ultimate victory I had won after all those years of enduring my family's relentless cruelty was something far more valuable. I finally possessed absolute, total, and unbreakable freedom. The greatest lesson this journey taught me is that your true worth is never defined by the people who try to tear you down. Toxic family members will often build fake empires on lies, expecting you to remain small just to make them feel powerful. But blood does not demand your endless sacrifice. True strength comes from walking away from their abuse, protecting your own peace, and building your authentic success from the ground up. Sometimes the absolute best way to win is to simply step back and let their house of cards collapse while you stand tall in your own truth. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your future? Share your story in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more journeys of reclaiming your power.